Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Join us right now from the Bay Area in the beautiful state of California. Our guest is here today to celebrate her early reader chapter book. It's called Mika's Quest. Please welcome to the show, Kat Fan. Hey, Kat, how are you?
I'm good. Hi, Jed. Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted to have you on, and I'm really excited for you to tell everybody all about Mika's Quest.
Yes. So Mika's Quest is an early reader's chapter book, and it's about a little girl named Mika who just loves adventure and is always seeking for it. And one day she just does that. She comes across like an enchanting pavilion out in the park while she's with her parents. And then from there, she just like goes on this adventure seeking for this lost artifact. And yeah, I would say the age range for Mika's Quest is around 6 to 9 years old. And she has a loyal companion named Polo, her unicorn. And it's basically like every child has that friend, whether it's like a stuffed animal or a creature or some type of keepsake or a lovey. And so for her, it was her unicorn.
My daughter grew up with a stuffed unicorn that she called Uni, and it was her buddy for many, many years. Yes. I have 3 kids, and my son is very attached to a hippo, and I have 2 other daughters, and one's attached to this purple unicorn, and another one's like a unikitty. And so they carry them everywhere. And, you know, I end up looking for ways like, oh, I need to buy different variations of this so that, if we lose one or if it gets too dirty or broken apart, we're like saved before they discontinued it, because you hear about those stories. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Hey, you know, you're mentioning that the lead character in Mika's Quest really loves adventure. I feel that that's certainly not every kid, but there are certain kids out there that just love to go on adventures. And the same is true of adults, you know, where some adults is like, yes, I'm going to go from point A to point B, but I want to know every place I'm going to stop along the way. Whereas other folks, it's like, yeah, I'm going to get there. I'm not quite sure when or where or how, but eventually we'll get there.
Yeah, just enjoying the journey versus the destination. Yeah, I think this book, it really focuses on like the imagination of a child. You know, for me growing up, we didn't have like TVs or cable or anything. And so my brother and I would just have these wild imaginations. Like we'll use the blow dryer as our equipment to like utilize to pretend to go through doors, and blankets for forts and stuff. And so with Mika, it was really important to find like, you can find adventure in your own backyard. And it's just a matter of seeing things differently in different perspectives. And so it's been a lot of fun writing this book because there's all of these scenes and landscapes throughout San Francisco with fun facts that people don't typically know. But I geek out about it because for me, wherever I go and I see something old or something that looks interesting, I like end up Googling it or figure out Google Lens to figure out what it is. And I'm like, oh, that is such an interesting fact. And so it's just like weaving it in here and finding history as something of like relevance, for kids too, because I do feel like it's something you need to instill a little bit earlier. And for myself, like going through school, history was a difficult topic because I was like, okay, how are you going to memorize what happened in like 1897 and which president is this and that? But having a relevance, how it's relevant to a child, like that's where it's going to stick.
Yeah. Hey, I'm really curious. We talk a lot about kids and screens, and you don't meet too many people. I mean, I'm almost 100 years old, and I grew up with a screen. I grew up with a TV. You just mentioned that you didn't grow up with any screens at all. First, what was that like, and how does that make you look at this debate we have about screens?
Oh, yeah. It's so interesting. So for me, I don't have one weight or the other on screens or no screen. I think there's a balance. But I do believe it's important for kids in the future generation to be able to embrace technology and not fall back with it. But that balance part is like where we're seeing the difficulties between children, and being able to understand like the instant gratification versus like knowing when to stop. But for myself, I didn't grow up with screens, not because of my parents' ideology, but I actually grew up in Stockton, California, which is like a very rough, high crime and poverty, city. And my parents were refugees from Vietnam. And so being like first generation, we didn't have any TV. We didn't own TV. They worked a lot. And so, for us, it was like, yeah, I don't think I watched my first like movie until ninth grade. And that I still remember. It's like A Walk to Remember with Me Anymore.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was like, it's weird to be like part of this generation and like not know any of the like trivia, for like mainstream or like popular media pieces. Cause I like don't have it with me.
Well, I remember that time in popular culture. I don't think you're missing all that much. But it sounds like you were kind of certainly your parents went on an adventure coming from Vietnam to the States. Did that influence you, or how did that influence you in the way you grew up and the way you look at the world now?
It influenced a lot about my sense of like empathy for other people, and just seeing things in the shoes of other people too. And then it also allows me to like make friends or relationships with people that you don't typically, would talk to. And that's only because of the way my parents, like their experience. And even in Mika's class, like for book 2, I already have like it written and everything piece it. And that book, chapter book is like heavier influence with my parents. But I didn't learn my parents' story until I went to college at Davis. And one of my assignments was like, get, a history of one of your parents, of like their upbringing and everything. And that's when I learned, like, from my mom, what was her journey like here. And I'm like, it just blew my mind, in terms of everything she went through at such a young age, and lived through.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I have memories of hearing about people immigrating from Vietnam, the boat people, and that whole terrifying experience that a lot of people went through. And I remember performing, now this is way back in the 80s. I do educational magic shows, and I remember meeting a girl in Springfield, Massachusetts, and she was telling me that her parents, she was maybe only 5 or 6 or 7 years old, but we were talking afterwards, and she was talking about her parents coming over, part of that immigration wave. And we just sat down, and I said, wow, did they ever talk to you about what that was like? And that must have been so, they must be so brave and courageous. And I remember the big smile that went on her face, thinking, yeah, my parents were really courageous.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And I think it's like for an individual, even to put like my parents or my mom in those shoes, like that took a lot of guts and a lot of resiliency, right? And persistent. And then I think about like a lot of the Vietnamese community look at like what's happening with Syria and what's happening with like Latin America and the immigration movement here. And so like, I think it's seeing like the courage that it takes for someone to drop everything of their lives and what they know, and for an opportunity that's better to just really break that cycle. And so even for me, like I grew up in like extreme, like we were in poverty and we didn't have a lot of things. And my parents worked a lot, but even for me to like have a college education and then, work at one of the top tech companies eventually and be able to like write a book. It's like, it's a lot of like impossible became possible. And I think I look back and it's like attributed to them, and they're constantly telling me like, oh yeah, like we did all of this so that you can have a chance for this. And so for me, like it really stuck, and I listened to it, what my parents would say. Granted, my younger siblings, it just goes through one ear and the other and like, blah, blah, you chose to do this. Whereas like with me, I'm like, oh, like I feel that, sense of like pride and that sense of like responsibility.
Yeah. Other than their advice and their support what was it that helped you and them break that cycle of poverty? Because we do hear about folks who come here and they give up everything, and then once they're here, they're kind of locked into that cycle of poverty for generations.
Mm-hmm. I think it's like resiliency. Like my parents have always worked, and that instilled in me like being a hard worker as well. Like I remember being 6 years old and going with them to trade shows in Vegas and helping select like potential merchandise for our store, to like waking up like at 4 a.m. to go to like markets in the morning to buy merchandise in bulk, and then like doing inventory and laying it out on the shelves. So this is a very different experience. And so I think with my parents, like they're constantly working, and if one route doesn't work, they don't give up. They try a different route. And so they've had multiple businesses, from like a Chinese restaurant to a hamburger joint to like a store that just had a variety of different items to a furniture store. And they just became like a jack of all trades. Like my mom was like selling like party favors for people's wedding, and she learned to print the ribbons, to like making flower bouquets to balloon bouquets. And then so I myself became very flexible and being able to adapt with them, at a really young age. And so it actually taught me a lot of like business skills, and it taught me a lot of street smarts at a really young age.
Yeah. That resiliency, that ability to bounce back, I think that is so very important. And I don't know if, and part of the way you develop that is by failing and picking yourself up and trying again, like your parents did, like I'm sure you did. I'm seeing a lot of parents are bubble wrapping their kids and not allowing them to fail at all. And I don't know, we didn't do that with our kids. Our kids failed a lot, and they're really strong. They're great adults, and they've become very successful. But I worry sometimes about those bubble wrap kids, thinking, wow, because life is going to knock them on their butts at some point. It just knocks us all.
Yeah. Most are not that lucky to never like experience hardship in some way or form, right? But yeah, I think like that is really important to address, and for a lot of parents or society as a whole to see as a trend. And even in my book, like Mika's Plus, I tried to adapt like coping mechanisms and pieces for like kids like that they can rely on, whether it's physical or where it's mental. And using this book when I visit schools too, I have an activity that is very like oh yeah, you hold this stone, it represents courage and wisdom. And if you're ever worried about anything that's happening or you're in front of people and you just feel super shy, like just remember, like, you're able to do this. And so I think a lot of, on top of like parents or kids being bubble wrapped, like they're also like already type A. They already have like, they're in dance teams already, gymnastics team at such a young age, having the craziest schedules, and all these commitments at a really young age. And so I think time will tell to see like what type of psyche we'll get out of that with this like generation of kids and with so much expectation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things I read on your website is you describe yourself as neurodivergent. How does that affect your day to day, and how does it affect Mika's quest?
Yes. So I am like, I have hypersomnia. So it's like very close to narcoleptic, type 2. I fall asleep so easily, which is like a blessing and a curse. Like on a flight before the plane even takes off, I'm out. And when I was going through college, I could just lay on a bench by the library and just go out and take a nap in like 20 minutes and feel refreshed. But some of the difficulties with it and learning to manage it to adulthood and to be successful, I had to like find different ways and tools to be able to manage it. And then the other piece is like, I am also dyslexic. It's heavier with numbers. So numbers freak me out. But I mean, I end up, finishing up to calculus by the time I hit high school. I went, to a UC and took math class there. So it's like doable as long as you're willing to put in the time and so much extra practice. But yeah, math, chemistry, anything that's like a lot of numbers, they just, flip a lot for me. And so I think for me, it's like really important, even with this book, that like, hey, if I can do it, like you can do it. In terms of like whatever your aspirations are, or like even as like a kid, like, oh, I want to tell my story one day. And I was like, you could, like there's nothing that really, will limit you other than you yourself, like not taking that step.
Yeah. Kat, you're talking, there's so many things that you're mentioning that I really respect, but I'm imagining there might be somebody out there saying, boy, Kat's talking about working really hard and putting all the extra work in, the extra effort, and there's some kids that calculus and math and numbers, it just comes so easy to them, and they don't have to work as hard as Kat, and that's not fair. And it's not. But what would you say to that person? Because when I hear somebody say, well, that's not fair, I kind of hear like, why give up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, my brother is 1 year younger than me, and he's a genius. I would be in calculus by the time I hit 12th grade. He already hit it by like 9th or 10th grade. And so he even taught himself how to play the baby grand piano we had at our house. Like now he's fluent in like Japanese, and he can do in translations. We're Vietnamese, so he speaks Vietnamese too, and English and everything. And so for me growing up, to see how easy it was for him was such a big pet peeve. But I think it was like, I actually feel like for whether if it's like fairness or not, is just like how you use your superpower, right? That you have. For him, he's very talented in this. And so he can leverage it to his skills. So whereas like mine was like, okay, I will just keep trying and have this mantra. Like if I fail, like I'll just keep trying. And if I'm terrified of trying because I don't want to fail in front of so many people, like I will just keep trying. And like at the end of the day, who would fault you for that, right? And so for me, like even that comparison with a brother that's like 1 year younger, like that over the years, especially in an Asian household, it was like, oh, he can do this better. Oh, he can do that. And then the dynamics between a boy and a girl too, because he was the boy, he can like go and see his friends. And my family was a very strict Catholic raised Vietnamese family. And so being the eldest girl, like I had a lot of limitations. And so I had to be very agile and very creative and very like, how do I work a way around this and like negotiate? And so at a really young age, I did that. And I think that became like a superpower, like growing up too. And I would say like for kids, like saying like, oh yeah, it's not fair and whatnot. But like once you figure out what it is that you're really strong at, like the other person's probably thinking it's not fair. Like maybe you make friends easily. Maybe you like have really good rhythm and can move to a beat, or like hear a song and just like be able to memorize it right away. And I think those are all different skill sets that like each person will discover as they grow.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you grew up very similar to the way my beautiful wife grew up, whose parents immigrated from Puerto Rico on the other side of the world, but somehow you guys have the same, the same values.
Experiences. Yes. Very similar experiences. I think with like the immigration and first generation, pieces. And yeah, I think like even for me, like my parents, they came here and they weren't as educated. And so for me, there's a lot of themes and topics in this book that I like wanted to have. I would wish I had that conversation with my parents growing up, or like being able to have that connection, or my parents like sitting next to me and reading to me. But they were always like working. And so to me, it's like, oh, like that time with reading with your kids is like really sacred. So I have a 6-year-old now, and for her, like she loves reading time. She would negotiate in barters, like, oh, I made a good decision. Can I have an extra book tonight to read? And then we'll end up like 5 books, 6 books. And then after a while, I'm like, okay, like stop the brakes. Like I can't read like 6 picture books, the same books every day. I know it's really good for them for retention, but in terms of my sanity and like being so tired after a full day of work. And so we started looking at chapter books. And that was like by the time she was 4.5. Yes. And so now that we're going through like Harry Potter series, read through it, and then we fast forward through parts of the movies. And now we're going through like Audible of Harry Potter, and we're like hearing new things all the time. But it's good piece because she'll ask questions like, oh, like, why did they do that? Or why didn't they do this? And it gives me a chance to talk to her about it, versus like her asking someone else or learning from someone else.
Right. What's the one thing that you think parents and kids who most want to talk about when they're talking about Mika?
Yes. So for Mika is really like the experience of trying new things, and having with Mika, like she also has a fear in this book too. She has a fear of heights. And she had to get over it. And I think like even at a young age, it has themes of being resilient here too. And like for her, Mika, she was transported from like, she was at the Golden Gate Park, and then all of a sudden she was transported to a different section of the city by herself, with Polo. But it's like saying like, oh yeah, she was born to do this. Like she has the smarts, and it's just a matter of taking the first step. And so I think with parents and going through this storyline, on top of like, parts of San Francisco and learning the pieces and like solving these riddles, there's a lot of tough conversations around like, why is this like, cause Mika, when I wrote it out, the dynamics, like her mom is making like bún bò Huế, which is like a Vietnamese noodle soup. But then her dad like calls her Mija, which is like a Spanish like for endearment for like girl, little like sweet daughter, girl. And so I think that gives parents and caregivers to have that conversation with the child, like, oh, what does this mean? Why? And I think that really gains that exposure that folks may not typically have.
Yeah. Hey, I think that people are going to have a great time reading Mika's Quest. But but they need to know where to go to find out more about the book and also find out more about you. Where should they go?
So they can actually go onto mikasquest.com. All of my information is there. Mika's Quest is also sold at every major bookseller that is existent. And so, so Amazon to local bookstores have access to this book. And I would love to get the feedback and see what everyone thinks.
Yeah, so if we always encourage folks to support their local bookshop, so you can go ask if they have Mika's Quest on their shelves. They may not. You can just ask them very politely if they can order it, and it'll be there in just a day or two.
Exactly. It'll get to you, and you'll have your hands on it and get a chance to see her adventure.
Yeah. We are really glad that we had a chance to take this adventure with our guest, Kat Fan, the author of Mika's Quest. Kat, thanks so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast and will join us for the next exciting episode. If you want to make sure you don't miss a second of the show, please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Stitch Radio, wherever you get your podcasts. And also be sure to visit readingwithyourkids.com and download your copy of the Reading With Your Kids online magazine. It's free. It's available at readingwithyourkids.com. Just click on our blog. Before we go, I want to make sure that I give a big thank you to my team: Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Madison Dairies, Soji Franklin, Monica Rivera Sosa, Ann O'Leary. I want to give a big thank you to my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me, and most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.